when Tetaga was brought back, he was then appointed ambassador extraordinaire and minister plenipotentiary. I'm not sure whether we have ever had that position again, but minister extraordinaire, or ambassador extraordinaire, and minister plenipotentiary. And then subsequently, John Tetaga was deployed to take up the leadership of the All Africa Federation of Trade Unions, ATOF. Later on, I'll highlight a bit the role of the TUC in the regional and continental organization. So I'll talk a bit about that then. But as part of the stormy relationship, sweet and sour, as it were, a number of seasoned trade union leaders were also made ambassadors and labor attaches. Some believe that it was as a reward for their contribution, but others also think that it was a way to weaken the leadership. That one, we may need a bit more historical inquiry to establish what the actual reasons were. But this is what happened. A number of them, And then some were also appointed onto state boards. And that included, at the time, DK Fovi, who was the chairman of TUC and also chairman of the Ghana Mine Workers Union. He was then made chairman of the Board of State Gold Mining Corporation. And then in 1964, a number of trade union general secretaries, 4 of them, were actually dismissed, either by newspaper publication or radio announcement. Leaders who had been duly elected in their own conferences. They were claimed to have had some secret meeting with some people, and on the basis of that, the CBP dismissed them from office. In the same way, in a non-broadcast, this time by the president himself, the TUC flag was abolished. The TUC had a flag then, so Secretary General could even fly a flag. A TUC flag was abolished and replaced with a CPP flag. So, especially under the First Republic, there was a give and take. The TUC won some recognition and strength and representativity, but it did so at the cost of a certain amount of loss of independence to itself. And this sweet and sour relationship actually marked the relationship between the TUC and subsequent regimes. When the 1966 coup occurred, Benjamin Bentum, who previously under Nkrumah had been a minister of forestry, but he was also in agricultural workers. Bentum was appointed the Secretary General by the NLC. And then Bentum invited the General Secretaries to a meeting, and they went to the meeting only to find out they had walked in to be arrested. And whilst these leaders were in custody, fresh elections were conducted in the TUC for new leaders to emerge. So the TUC, under Bendum's leadership, in the initial stages actually, then helped the TUC to align itself with a new regime and not go confrontational. But that regime witnessed considerable retrenchment of workers from state-owned enterprises then. So the TUC lost membership. And then the Civil Service Interim Regulations, LI 47, was also repealed, So civil servants were no more compelled to be members of the TUC. And then the NLC, they amended the Armed Forces Act of 1962 and made preparations towards the organization of a general strike a criminal offense of subversion, punishable by a death penalty or 25 years imprisonment. So that was the NLC and its attitude to unionism. It came very early. The same NLC supported the dismissal of over 2,000 workers from cargo handling who had gone on strike, a one-day strike, demanding the removal of their general manager and the personnel manager. They were dismissed. And this was in 1968. In March the same year, March 69, over 6,000 mine workers from Ashanti Goldfields Corporation, then AGC, who went on strike over severance pay, were shot at in a confrontation with the military and police, leading to 3 deaths. In another incident involving mining workers, again, there was a shootout with tear gas and other ammunition, which left many workers injured. So the NLC period marked a very turbulent period in terms of relations between the TUC and government. Even though initially Bentum had been appointed, in fact, very quickly, within a year, the gap between the TUC that they tried to get compliant initially and government had begun to diverge. And this relationship, the turbulent relationship, carried on into the regime of the Progress Party government in the Second Republic. And it was during the Second Republic that the TUC clashed with the government over minimum wage. They wanted, at that time, minimum wage to be raised from, I think, 75 cedis to 150, 1.75 pence a day to 1 cedi 50 pesos. And there was a huge clash, And the government then went into parliament. At that time, they had the longest sitting of parliament then, 17.5 hours or so. And then they dissolved the TUC with Act 3A3. This was on September 13th, 1971. And interesting enough, save for a brief strike by railway workers in the Sekondi Takoradi area, there wasn't much protest. Of course, the unions were still there, and they now could get together to form a new center if they so wished. But government formed receivers to take over the assets of the TUC and dispose of them. Of course, we all know that 4 months after the dissolution of the TUC, September 13th to January 13th, there was a coup d'etat which overthrew the Wuzia regime. And within a month, less than a month after the new government came into being, the TUC was restored. Now, one of the hallmarks of the Champon regime was that, at least in its very initial stages, it developed very close relations with the TUC. And there was a lot of consultation. In fact, we learned that the labor minister at the time, I think Kana Abu also, used to be a regular visitor to the Hall of Trade Unions. And it was also during this period that this edifice, which had been built by the TUC with a loan from the Nkrumah government, by which I don't think it had finished paying. It was during a Champions period, in its early days, that this structure was formally handed over, to the TUC as its property. The relations between the TUC and the NRC were also such that, for those who are old enough, maybe I shouldn't say that, but there was at some point when there used to be shortages of what used to be called essential commodities. You'll be surprised to find out what those things are. A TUC was a major part of those who could distribute goods, to their members. That was the nature of the relationship. But a major restraint on union activity, which was introduced by the Champagne government, was the decree which established the Prices and Incomes Board and required that all collective agreements should be, when you negotiated an increase, it should be approved by the Price and Incomes Board. And that was a major thing that unions fought for many years, long even after the Champagne regime left. But all in all, the relations were cordial. So cordial that, in fact, at a time when most people in the country rose up against a Champagne's union government idea for a new government, when the Champagne was under pressure for constitutional rule. When most of the society was against it, at least the organized portions, the TUC leadership expressed support for Unigov on condition that it will lead to socialism. Then we come to, after 40 years, when we get into the PNDC era, because there wasn't much. The PMP didn't stay long enough, and they didn't have any relations as such, with the, anything worth recalling here. But under the PNDC, initially, there was considerable hostility to the TUC. And in fact, it even manifested in the formation of defense committees in workplaces, workers' defense committees. So there was contention in the workplace as to who could actually support, who was supposed to promote and defend workers' interests, whether it was the defense committees or it was unions. Yeah. So, and then over the period of the Champagne regime, considerable alienation had also developed between the TUC and its leadership. So by the time of and in fact, during the Third Republic, there was a famous invasion of parliament by workers of Tema from Georg workers. They invaded parliament. And then, in fact, from parliament, I think they came to the TUC here, So at that time, there was considerable tension between some sections, militant workers, and the TUC leadership. And in the early days of the PNDC, that grew into what came to be known as Association of Local Unions of Accra Tema, ALU. And ALU had some support from the PNDC. So apart from the WDCs, which were creating problems for the unions in the workplaces, ALU had also emerged. And what was interesting was that some of the people in ALU were strong trade unionists who didn't like what was happening with the WDCs in the workplaces and thought that they should move to be able to push or get the trade union leadership to become part of the revolution in such a way that the union will survive. The union will survive. So ALU also emerged, as I said, with support from the PNDC. But it didn't take long before, and in fact, Alu took over the Hall of Trade Unions in April 1982. But shortly after Alu took over, they had to go around the country to try to get an acceptance. And they called an initial conference first. After going around, they called an initial conference about July or so in 82. And then in that July conference, they were asked to go and reorganize and call a proper Congress of the TUC within a year. So by 1983, December, TUC had to go to Congress to elect a new Secretary General. In the Alu period, they had formed interim management committees. So all unions formed their interim management committees, and then they had a interim management committee of all the unions working together in what today will be the General Council. So that lasted until December 83, when Congress was convened and Secretary General A.K. Yankee was elected. Initially, the TUC was playing it careful. I mean, military regime, strong regime. But by 1984-85, it became clear that the PNDC, which had come touting lots of revolution and all that, had buckled under pressure and had gone to the IMF and introduced what was then called the Economic Recovery Program, which in effect actually was a structural adjustment program. And we know what SAP has meant historically for us. Loss of jobs, massive. And trade liberalization and just an opening up of our economy in ways that leave little room for independence. So by 1984, the TUC, in fact 85, the TUC became very critical, started getting critical of the PNDC. In 1986, it went on to actually call for a People's Assembly, as a framework for deciding policy. Because by then the TUC had begun to question how come a provisional government, could stay in power that long. And it was partly as a result of that in fact, partly as a result of that call for People's Assembly, that the National Commission for Democracy, which had been established then, started then also collating views about what to do in terms of constitutional rule. And towards the end of the 80s, there had been considerable retrenchment, and then end of service benefits had to be paid. And end of service benefits, there had been negotiated huge sums. And in fact, what had happened with end of service benefits was that in the state-owned enterprises, in many cases, when workers went to negotiate and they got, say, 1 month or 2 months for each completed day of service, the management personnel will take even higher. So they will give something good to the workers so that they could even make their own better. So when the divestiture occurred and all these, there was a lot of debt. The government then decided to freeze end of service benefits. In fact, it started off by trying to cancel it. It wanted to cancel it. And the TUC said, no way. You can't cancel what has been duly negotiated. So rather than cancel, it said it will freeze. And in exchange for freezing the end of service benefits, what the TUC managed to secure through negotiation was a transformation of the SNIT scheme from a provident fund scheme into a pension scheme. Until 1990, the Social Security scheme was just a provident fund scheme. A scheme by which, they'll take your contributions, and then when you are due to go on retirement, a lump sum with some interest was given to you. But then, with the freezing of the end of service benefits and through the pressure of the TUC, then the SNIT scheme was transformed into a pension scheme. And then the frozen end of service benefits were agreed to be paid in tranches over a number of years, which is what happened. Around the end of the 90s also, the TUC joined forces with others in the country to actually demand a constitutional rule. In fact, at the 1988 Congress of the TUC, the government was so busy trying to influence the outcome of the elections that they lost their eye on the resolutions of Congress, which called clearly for multipartyism, and that gave a lot of people also the vim, to pursue multipartyism in that period. So, what I think we want to be asking ourselves is how the TUC has managed to balance its relationship or its role as a partner in development with its role as a champion of workers representing their needs. On the one hand, you can see that TUC got close to government. It made some gains. It got a voice. But on the other hand, also, it lost out in some areas quite seriously. So we remind ourselves of a continuous tension between autonomy, as an organization, and then also collaboration with those in power. But I think it's important to see that after the structural adjustment period, right into the 90s, 2000s, even up to today, we can talk about what we call a neoliberal onslaught. Neoliberal onslaught. And we are talking about the structural adjustment program, the mass retrenchment, and the informalization of labor. Because many more workers now have been lost from the formal sector into the informal sector. And it was actually as part of this neoliberal onslaught that the processes for a new Labor Act began. That process actually began, I think, in 1998. Was it 98 or 99? I was asking when the processes for the new Labor Act, was it 98 that it started, when they tried to push it and we boycotted? Yes. 98, yeah. And yeah, Alex. 97, eh? There was first a meeting, so Alpha was 98. There was first actually a meeting at Tulip, Golden Tulip, yeah, where they brought a draft. The first time they wanted us to discuss a new labor law, they came with a draft. Yes. They came with a complete draft. And we said, no, it doesn't work that way. So we went to Soga together. At that time, Shishineros, employers, government, and labor, to start a discussion of a new Labor Act. And there also, Employers Association, I think the Executive Secretary was Samuel Siando. Two people, two predecessors. The second predecessor before Alexia. And Samuel Siando and his people had, cooked to remove the check-off system. That was one of their targets, for the new labor reform. So I remember Danentry of blessed memory. He led us in Sugar, to boycott that meeting with some choboi. And then, of course, once we asked that if the point of if Chekhov was not negotiable, you know, so if that's what it was about, then we're not going to be part of any discussion at all. So they took the hint, and we began a process of proper collaboration, discussing what we wanted to see change in the law. You know, they formed a committee, we sent some people there, they even did some study tours. They worked together over a period. And in fact, the government then couldn't finish. So it went into another government, you know. I think it was President Rawlings' government, then the second term as elected president. Couldn't finish, it went into President Kufuor, before finally that law was promulgated in 2003. You know, but it was part of the attempt to liberalize the trade union scene, and that's when freedom of association, you know, and of course, we know what has happened since then, especially in terms of freedom of association. The unity of the movement that existed before was not there anymore. And anybody who felt slightly aggrieved either broke away to form a new union, or people could even now form unions and register them before they start looking for members. It's a fact. If you check closely enough, there are some unions like that, you know, still here in this country. But also, in that period, also as part of our search, and going back to the previous preoccupation, also with social and economic activities, towards the end of the 90s, the TUC established the Labour Enterprises Trust as a way of mobilizing resources, you know, and to also intervene directly in the economy itself. Unfortunately, we were undercapitalized. We didn't get as much as we wanted. So LET couldn't do as much as it did. But let's set up unique insurance company. And later on, also supported the setting up of, but now what's the name of the bank? Golden Pride. UBA. Okay. But I think the inability to realize what we wanted, notwithstanding, it raises a question, you know, about economic activity and the whole question of workers' capital, and also the huge pension funds, which are essentially workers' money. And I think this is something that, going forward, you know, unions can consider very seriously on how to use. Now, at the beginning, I said that my topic was Gold Coast to Ghana and beyond, 80 years of solidarity, struggle, and the unfinished business of social justice. So I just want to turn quickly to the social justice question and to pose a few things. Now, when we talk about social justice, we are talking about, among other things, about the achievement of civil and political liberties, like freedom of expression and the right to vote. And on the social side, social, economic, and cultural rights, we are talking about the right to education, to health care, to a living wage, and social protection, and to a healthy environment. Now let's take the question of living wage. It is not a secret that wages in Ghana are low. And in fact,